The botched execution of Margaret Pole. The execution of Margaret Pole wasn't just another brutal Tudor beheading, but a horrifying spectacle that shocked even hardened witnesses at the Tower of London. Most people think of Tudor executions as swift, dignified affairs, where nobles met their fate with a single clean blow from an expert headsman. The public perception was that even in death, aristocrats maintained their dignity through quick, merciful endings. But behind all that surface-level understanding was something full of dark, surprising, and twisted elements that turned a routine execution into a nightmare of incompetence and cruelty. In the 16th century, a botched execution was considered not just a failure, but an omen of divine displeasure, something that would haunt the executioner and the crown forever. Margaret Pole stood on Tower Green that morning of May 27, 1541, knowing she was about to die for crimes she never committed. This 67-year-old woman, the last of the Plantagenet bloodline, faced the headsman's block because Henry VIII feared her royal heritage more than any actual treason she might have plotted. A frail grandmother becomes so dangerous to a king that her mere existence threatens his throne. The irony cuts deep when you realize Margaret had served the Tudor court faithfully for decades, even nursing Henry's own daughter Mary through childhood illnesses with tender devotion. She had been Catherine of Aragon's most trusted lady-in-waiting, a position that brought her close to the royal family's most intimate moments. Henry needed a scapegoat for his son Reginald Pole's defiance from Rome, and Margaret's Plantagenet blood made her the perfect target for his paranoid rage. Margaret represented everything Henry feared most about his own legitimacy, a woman whose bloodline stretched back through the true kings of England, while Henry's claim rested on battlefield victory and political maneuvering. Margaret's father was George, Duke of Clarence, brother to Edward IV and Richard III, making her royal blood more pure than Henry's own Tudor lineage. The king had restored her family's honors in 1512, even granting her the title Countess of Salisbury and vast estates that made her one of the wealthiest women in England. Yet by 1536, her son, Cardinal Reginald Pole, had written scathing attacks against Henry's break with Rome, calling the king's marriage to Anne Boleyn a disgrace to Christendom. Henry's response wasn't to pursue the son safely ensconced in Italy, but to destroy the mother trapped within his reach. Margaret spent 2.5 years in the Tower before her execution, a period that reveals the calculated cruelty behind her eventual death. The king paid for her maintenance, even ordering warm gowns and footwear for her comfort just months before commanding her execution. This wasn't neglect or forgotten imprisonment, but deliberate psychological torture designed to break her spirit before breaking her neck. She lived in constant uncertainty, never knowing if each dawn would bring her final summons, watching other prisoners march to their deaths while she remained suspended between life and execution. The physical conditions weren't brutal by Tower standards, but the mental anguish of prolonged captivity with her grandson Henry Pole, who was also imprisoned for his family's supposed treason, created a special kind of hell. The most twisted aspect was how Henry used Margaret's imprisonment as leverage against her son Reginald. The king sent messages through diplomatic channels, making it clear that the mother's life depended on the son's submission, turning familial love into a weapon of state policy. Reginald refused to return from Rome, knowing his mother understood the political necessity of his defiance, even as it sealed her fate. Margaret never wavered in her support for her son's principles, even when that support guaranteed her destruction. The psychological warfare extended to forcing her to witness the execution of other family members and allies, a deliberate campaign to isolate her completely before her own death. Henry's paranoia had transformed a loyal noblewoman into the most dangerous person in England, simply by virtue of her bloodline. The morning of Margaret's execution revealed incompetence that transformed state justice into bloody farce. The Tower's regular executioner wasn't available that day, forcing officials to use an inexperienced substitute who had never beheaded a member of the nobility before. The horror of watching a terrified axeman approach the block, knowing he lacked the skill for a clean kill, must have been overwhelming. The normal protocol called for a single swift blow that would sever the head cleanly, preserving whatever dignity remained in judicial murder. Margaret was told to kneel and place her neck on the block, but the substitute executioner's first swing missed her neck entirely, gashing deep into her shoulder and sending blood spurting across the scaffold. Proper executions required years of training and steady nerves that only came with experience. A 67-year-old woman, already weakened by imprisonment, suddenly wounded and panicking as she realized her death would be neither quick nor merciful. Contemporary accounts describe how Margaret tried to rise from the block after the first blow, her survival instincts overriding her resignation to death. The executioner, already rattled by his failure, began swinging wildly as Margaret moved around the scaffold, turning what should have been a solemn judicial proceeding into a grotesque chase scene. The Spanish ambassador Eustace Chapuis later reported that it took 11 blows to finally sever Margaret's head, though some modern historians suggest this number might be exaggerated for dramatic effect. Yet even if the actual count was lower, multiple blows were required to finish what should have been accomplished with one. Each swing of the axe sent more blood across the scaffold, staining the wooden platform that had witnessed countless other executions with unusual amounts of gore. The witnesses, hardened courtiers accustomed to public deaths, reportedly grew sick watching the butchery unfold before them. The regular Tower executioner was deliberately sent away on other business, suggesting Henry's officials either wanted Margaret's death to be particularly brutal or simply didn't care enough to ensure competent personnel. The substitution wasn't an accident, but a calculated insult to her noble status, treating the last Plantagenet princess like a common criminal, unworthy of professional execution. Yet the incompetence backfired spectacularly because instead of dying quietly and being quickly forgotten, Margaret's botched beheading became legendary for its horror. The aftermath of Margaret's execution created exactly the opposite effect Henry intended when he ordered her death. Instead of eliminating Plantagenet opposition, the brutal spectacle generated sympathy for Margaret and disgust toward the king's increasingly tyrannical methods. The psychological impact on courtiers who witnessed an elderly woman hacked to death by an incompetent executioner in the name of Tudor justice was profound. The Spanish ambassador's detailed reports spread across Europe, portraying Henry as a monster willing to torture innocent grandmothers for imaginary crimes against his throne. Margaret's dignity in facing such a horrible death contrasted sharply with the cowardice of a king who couldn't face his enemies directly. Foreign courts receiving news that England's king had butchered an elderly woman whose only crime was giving birth to a son who criticized royal policy from safe exile saw the execution as desperate rather than decisive, suggesting Henry's grip on power was weaker than his propaganda claimed. Margaret's refusal to confess any wrongdoing, even under torture and prolonged imprisonment, made her appear martyred rather than justly punished. The broader political consequences proved even more damaging to Henry's reputation than the immediate horror of the execution itself. European Catholic powers, already suspicious of Henry's religious policies, pointed to Margaret's death as proof of his descent into tyranny. Her son Reginald used his mother's martyrdom as powerful propaganda against Henry's regime, arguing that any king willing to murder innocent women for political convenience had forfeited all moral authority. The execution strengthened rather than weakened Catholic opposition to Henry's religious settlements. The most ironic twist was how Margaret's death accelerated exactly the religious conflicts Henry hoped to prevent. The brutal execution convinced many English Catholics that compromise with Henry's religious policies was impossible, driving previously moderate nobles toward open opposition. Margaret became a symbol of Catholic resistance to Protestant innovation, her bloody death serving as a rallying point for future rebellions. The execution that was supposed to intimidate potential traitors instead inspired them by demonstrating the lengths Henry would go to eliminate perceived threats. Margaret's death marked the point where Henry's paranoia transformed from political calculation into pathological obsession with destroying anyone who reminded him of his own illegitimate claims to the throne. The legal precedent established by Margaret's execution created dangers that eventually threatened Henry's own dynasty. By executing Margaret without trial or formal charges, Henry established the principle that royal blood alone constituted sufficient grounds for judicial murder. The precedent this set for future monarchs dealing with inconvenient relatives who possessed competing claims to the throne was ominous. The absence of any formal legal process meant that accusations of treason could be based entirely on bloodline rather than actual criminal behavior. Henry's paranoia had reached the point where he saw threats in genealogy rather than action. This legal environment meant any person with royal connections could be executed simply for existing, creating a climate of terror among the nobility that extended far beyond obvious political opponents. Margaret's case proved that loyal service, advanced age, and female gender provided no protection against royal suspicion once a person was deemed genetically dangerous to the crown. The implications for Henry's own children were profound and ultimately tragic. If royal blood could justify execution without trial, then Henry's daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, faced similar dangers whenever their legitimacy conflicted with political necessity. The precedent Margaret's death established would later threaten the very Tudor dynasty Henry was trying to protect, as subsequent monarchs used similar logic to eliminate inconvenient relatives. Her execution created a template for royal fratricide that would haunt English politics for generations. The most shocking aspect was how Henry's legal innovation actually weakened rather than strengthened royal authority. By abandoning traditional legal procedures that required evidence and formal charges, Henry made his own power appear arbitrary and capricious rather than divinely ordained. Foreign observers noted that kings who needed to murder grandmothers to maintain their thrones probably lacked the legitimate authority they claimed to possess. The execution revealed weakness rather than strength, desperation rather than confidence. Margaret's death without trial established a precedent that would eventually be used to justify executing Henry's own son-in-law and granddaughter when political circumstances demanded their removal. The religious dimension of Margaret's execution revealed the spiritual crisis consuming Henry's court in 1541. Margaret died not just as a political prisoner, but as a Catholic martyr whose faith remained unshakable despite years of pressure to conform to Henry's religious innovations. The symbolic power of an elderly woman choosing death rather than betraying beliefs that connected her to centuries of English Catholic tradition was immense. The execution took place during a period when Henry was desperately trying to establish religious legitimacy for his break with Rome, making Margaret's defiant faith particularly threatening to royal authority. Margaret represented continuity with England's Catholic past at exactly the moment Henry needed to convince people that Protestantism was England's natural religious destiny. A woman whose family had ruled England when it was unquestionably Catholic, whose very existence reminded people that Henry's religious changes were recent innovations rather than ancient traditions. Her refusal to accept Henry's spiritual authority, even under threat of death, suggested that many English people might prefer traditional Catholicism to royal Protestant experiment. The timing of Margaret's execution, coming during Henry's brief reconciliation with conservative Catholic factions at court, revealed the complex religious politics surrounding her death. Henry was simultaneously trying to appear more Catholic to satisfy domestic opposition while maintaining his break with papal authority. Margaret's execution sent mixed messages about royal religious policy, suggesting Henry wasn't sure whether he wanted to appear as a Catholic king who happened to reject papal authority, or as a Protestant innovator replacing Catholic traditions entirely. The most ironic aspect was how Margaret's Catholic martyrdom actually strengthened rather than weakened English Catholicism. Her dignified death provided a powerful example of how faithful Catholics should respond to Protestant persecution, inspiring others to maintain their religious convictions despite royal pressure. The execution created a martyr whose memory would sustain English Catholic resistance for decades after her death. Stories of her final prayers and refusal to compromise her beliefs spread through underground Catholic networks, making her more dangerous dead than alive. Margaret's religious witness demonstrated that Henry's attempt to control English spirituality through political terror was failing to achieve the spiritual transformation he desperately sought. The personal dimensions of Margaret's relationship with the royal family made her execution particularly shocking to contemporary observers. This wasn't just the death of a distant relative, but the brutal murder of a woman who had served as a surrogate mother to Princess Mary and a trusted confidant to Queen Catherine of Aragon during some of the most difficult periods of their lives. The psychological impact on Mary, who lost her beloved governess and unofficial grandmother to her father's paranoid rage, was devastating. Margaret had been present during Mary's childhood illnesses, providing comfort and care that helped the princess survive the emotional trauma of her parents' divorce. Henry's capacity for personal cruelty had expanded to include people who had shown nothing but loyalty and affection toward his family. The betrayal was profound. A woman who had dedicated years of her life to caring for Henry's daughter, being repaid with imprisonment and brutal execution. Margaret had witnessed Mary's birth, supported Catherine during the king's attempts to annul their marriage, and provided stability during the most turbulent period of the young princess's life. The execution destroyed relationships that had sustained the royal family through previous crises. Mary lost not just a beloved surrogate grandmother, but her last tangible connection to her mother's household and the Catholic faith that had shaped her early years. Margaret's death removed one of the few people who could provide Mary with emotional support independent of her father's approval, leaving the princess increasingly isolated within a court that viewed her Catholic sympathies with suspicion. The most heartbreaking aspect was how Margaret's loyalty to Mary ultimately sealed her fate. Her continued correspondence with the princess, offering spiritual guidance and emotional support, was used as evidence of her treasonous intentions to restore Catholic authority in England. Letters expressing grandmother affection for a young woman facing religious persecution were twisted into proof of political conspiracy against the crown. The execution showed that Henry viewed any independent relationship with his children as potential treason, turning family affection into grounds for judicial murder. Margaret's death taught Mary that even the most devoted service to the Tudor family could be rewarded with destruction if it conflicted with Henry's political calculations. The botched execution of Margaret Pole didn't happen by accident. It occurred with specific calculated cruelty designed to terrorize anyone who might challenge Tudor authority through bloodline or religious conviction. The situation wasn't what people assume. It was something intentional. Henry's decision to execute Margaret without trial while using an inexperienced headsman wasn't incompetence, but deliberate humiliation designed to strip away any dignity from the last Plantagenet death. The deeper motivation was Henry's recognition that Margaret represented everything his reign tried to eliminate: legitimate royal bloodline, unwavering Catholic faith, and moral authority that didn't depend on political success. Margaret Pole's execution may not have been what people expected by today's standards, but it was something else entirely by design. In that world, normal expectations of legal justice and merciful death were not the actual purpose. The real purpose was demonstrating that no one, regardless of age, gender, loyalty, or noble birth, could challenge Tudor authority and survive. The people involved didn't just survive political turmoil, they mastered the art of using terror to maintain political control. In the end, their true legacy was not in what appeared on the surface as routine judicial execution. It was in the lasting impact of showing how far royal paranoia could corrupt traditional concepts of justice and mercy. And for Margaret Pole's botched execution, lasting impact was everything, creating a symbol of Catholic martyrdom that would inspire resistance to Protestant authority for generations after her brutal death finally ended on Tower Green.